Because I got a few questions today during my interview for the documentary that I felt I need to answer in a more descriptive way. So, both Uncle Ong and my native grandmother spoke of a time before the Ice Age, about years ago, roughly, is the time they both referred to. They spoke of an incredibly advanced culture around the world, and it was a mix of modern humans and prehistoric humans, what we understand as, cryptids, Bigfoot, etc. Dog people, Wachugi, the Ishka, Anas, a bunch of other different cryptids all lived together. And there were also quite a few ancient remnant species still around, be they plants. A lot of jungle lands were evident all over the planet at that time. We had a very warm state of affairs. We averaged 98-degree days, that sort of thing, before the Ice Age. So there was a lot of jungle, and there was a lot of open land, a lot of open space. And each culture had very vast cities and complexes of people that worked together. And what we understand today as Cahokia was one of those major cities, roughly 130,000 years ago, pre-Ice Age. At that time, that city was vast jungle, much like South America is today. And we had sculpted grounds, as in we had gardens. We had, like South America, sculpted land that we could harvest from that had particular plants in it that we had cultivated. And we had vast pyramidal systems in that area. What's left today are just the tops and the later cultures that built on top of the previous cultures, from what I understand. So, pre-Ice Age, we walked with dinosaurs, sauropods, tetrasaurs, other little leftover creatures, great big sharks, megalodons, and those were commonplace during that era still, and actually continues on in some locations even today. It's probably what, things like Nessie or Clyde are. They might be, you know, plesiosaur. The encounters in the Congo with sauropods, and then you've got, Montana's tetradactyls. Those are all prehistoric creatures that are being sighted modernly today. And those were things that were alive during, the pre-Ice Age period. So, what my native grandmother described as the lore of Cahokia was that it was originally, during this time, almost 50 million strong as far as inhabitants. And that the primary middle of America was a vast cultivated garden that fed the rest of us around the world, at least on our side of the planet. Egypt and Upper Africa had a similar thing going on at the time. There was, a pyramidal system in Lower Africa at that time around Lake Victoria, and that was a very fertile area. The river system at that point went from the delta all the way to Lake Victoria and had expansive, massive floodplains. The cities in Africa were very advanced. They had huge walls around them. They had running water. They had toiletry systems, same as here as in America. We had aqueduct systems that fed our gardens. We had running water. We had the ability to smelt metal. And we traded internationally that way. We traded in solid goods, metals and minerals and that sort of thing. For instance, there have been 50-pound copper mina ingots found historically, well, just recently, actually, a few years ago, in the Hebrew lands that actually came from America and the Native American Sioux Indian area of our copper mines. Copper all have each ore of copper, just like any mineral, has its particular content, be it chromium content or tin or molybdenum or some other pollutant agent that delineates which mine or region or area it comes from. And any of you that have a little bit of a metallurgical background will understand that. You know, bell bronze is not the same as silver copper, for instance. There are 27-ish or 28 alloys of copper and bronze that are currently known. There were more in the past, but there were more mines in the past. So our cultures were incredibly advanced. We had international trade. We did some of that by boat. We did some of it over land. And our cultures had ways of communicating to each other internationally. We did have what you might consider a portal door kind of. Well, Uncle Long described it as somewhat Star Trek-ish, where you could walk through a stone door and you would walk into another portion of the planet, supposedly. At least that's what his stories described and how he thought of that thing, you know, that uh, technology. The other is our technology was much more mineral-based. We dealt a lot with sound, frequency, water, and harmonics, sympathetic, magnetic relationships, and static relationships between things. A lot of stones could be charged and used as power sources, kind of thing. Some of the bizarre stuff that he described seems very much like some of the stuff we've been finding and don't know how to explain. Diorite was one of the stones that was commonly used during that time period. For instance, in diorite, we've seen in unusual deposits and unusual structures, as in being lathed, turned on a machine in Egypt. Well, that was because they had an advanced system at that time. They actually worked with not just harmonic energies, which is part of what the pyramids supposedly were. They were a power plant and a power source, according to my Uncle Ong. And that system of power plants was all over the planet, and it worked in unison with the core of our planet and the sympathetic relationship of energies within our planet and in our solar system, is how he described it. So we dealt a lot with, things that we're just rediscovering now. And that was common practice during that supposed time. So when that all kind of abruptly ended because the Ice Age began, the Pleistocene era epoch finally started to freeze us again. And around 120 to maybe 115,000 years ago, the Ice Age, which we actually brought on by some of our technology, we were stupid and we tried to freeze our planet to make it into a superconductor, and it froze our planet along with us and everything that was on it. So that was kind of a warning idea from my Uncle Ong about what potentially our current technologies are heading towards. And this is something he told me about when I was a child. He was very aware of the technology, and he described it in very similar terms to how we understand it today. The concepts of superconductors, that sort of thing. He told me about frozen magnets before people figured it out, for instance. So it was leftover lore that he understood from his culture as a wild man. And so after we froze the heck out of ourselves and we caused our own epoch, we started our own ice age. Our ice age advanced rather quickly in the beginning, according to Uncle Ong's lore. We froze ourselves to death pretty quickly, a few thousand years. And we had to deal with what came after. We didn't understand in that culture that doing that would actually bring other things that were more dormant out of the ground and out of, recessed areas of warmth within our shell of a planet. Because there was kind of a description, the way he described our planet was that it is, well, kind of like what my grandmother's stories were. our planet is actually a living creature of some sort. Some of the stories suggest it's a giant coral polyp, but it is more elemental than that. It has a elemental core, according to Uncle Ong's stories, meaning that the material within the core of our planet goes plasmic, is how he described it, as being an elemental energy. So we not only have the iron core and magma, that sort of thing, but we also have an energy element to it that we may not currently be aware of, that he seemed to be very aware of. So once we survived, sort of, we lost a lot. We lost the great cities. When Cahokia was the main factor, there were like cities all over the world, and they eroded very quickly. They degraded. They went into nothing. As the ice advanced, people had to move out of those regions. They had to move into warmer climates around our midsection. And over the next approximately 120,000 years-ish, we'd been mostly frozen. And, our once very flourishing planet became very reduced. Our jungles went away. We had massive droughts, and those droughts were not an imbalance sort of thing. We didn't uh, we didn't have a quick way of recovering in most cases. It seemed like droughts would be persistent for hundreds, if not thousands, of years in some areas. I think that's similar to some of the stuff that happens currently, uh, because we've overstressed either the energy or the environment itself. And that was the similar things that both my native grandmother spoke of in her lores, and Uncle Ong's. So how my grandmother had the prehistory of the Ice Age was because we had marriage ties into cryptid families. It was not uncommon, uh, even 500 years ago, to have incredibly strong marriage ties with a very unusual group of peoples. We married into the Wachugi, we married into the Dogman peoples, we married into the Skaakum, the Yaren, etc., the Guanche. We had genetic ties to all of these people. That's why, some modern people have very unusual characteristics. Some people have unusual features, or they have unusual body types, or they have unusual strength, and they can't explain it. Well, it's because somewhere in ancient times, your family probably had a relationship with a cryptid, which was normal during those times. It was not abnormal in any way, according to both my grandmother's stories and Uncle Ong's stories. So I told you about that because I actually wanted to tell you a story about a Northwestern man that has been misrepresented in history. He has been colonized in his nature, much like Rausch, the Mararike Berber man who was a dog man who was captured in battle and sold as a slave repeatedly until the church bought him and turned him into St. Christopher. By the way, his life ended because he was beheaded for being a Christian man. And it was only later, after his destruction, that his iconography changed from that of a true upright walking dog man with no clothing on to the church making him into a humanoid with clothing on and called him a person and not what it really was, which was a hairy dog person. So many of you may have heard the story of Paul Bunyan. And, he's spoken of as a giant individual with a blue ox. There's also of massive size. So the native story about Paul Bunyan, whose original name is Toknik, Tokonek, Tokonek. I don't know what language Tokonek comes from, and I haven't been able to find a resource that can translate Tolkonek, but that was supposedly Paul Bunyan's original native name as a Wachugi man. So Wachugis, let me turn my camera, well, no, I can't turn my camera around. I'll bring the picture up. So in my previous videos, I've shown you what a Wachugi man looks like, according to my drawings. So Paul Bunyan looked very much like a human, a prehistoric humanoid man. He had the upper body, very long arms, but very much like a human. He had lower legs of a dog man and feet of a dog person. And there was a Wachugi man here in the Northwest in the 1845s. And that's where your Paul Bunyan stories come from. So, Tolkonek was about 8 feet tall, and he was a runner. He served the purpose of a tradesman, and he would run to people to provide goods to them. He would provide food, he would provide protection, etc. It was part of his duties as part of his tribal, standing. So when the logging area in southern Oregon, Idiottsville, Oregon to be exact, was the logging base camp that he would travel to with Big Blue. Big Blue was actually named Bessy, Bessy, in a remembrance for Queen Elizabeth I, because evidently this Wachugi man revered the politics that Elizabeth I maintained. No marriage, no children, don't marry your enemy. He felt that that was a very honest, earnest, strong leader for a woman. And because his tribe, like many other indigenous tribes, our chiefs are actually women. When you find a man as a chief, you have a war chief, not a peace chief. Peace chiefs are the women, the elder women, who maintain a body of law within the culture. We give out our advice, and we are the ones that say, no, I don't agree with what's going on here. We need to do something about it. And we enlist either our husbands or our sons to be our war chiefs and go do battle for us to protect our children, because that is what existence is about. Reproducing and passing your lore on and living in harmony with the world. So, Tolkonek became friends with the logging people at Idiottsville, Oregon. And he supplied goods to that region. He was a very common trader in the area. And Bessie was actually a sauropod. Another thing about the sauropods is supposedly the females were very picky about having mates, so they were very infrequent in egg laying. Another reason for naming her Bessie. And she was a juvenile, she wasn't full grown yet. It takes a very long time, according to my grandmother's lore, for what we call dinosaurs to age and to grow. It would take an average of 30 to 40 years for their bones to harden, for instance. They had very spongy, kind of like your hyoid bone. That was their body structure. So it would take them a very long time for their bones to harden. And Bessie was actually his pack animal. And according to the stories, sauropods acted a lot like elephants in some of their manners. They would slide down hills, for instance, crawling with their front legs and dragging their back legs in order not to put too much weight on their back legs and lose footing. So they were smart enough to figure out how to cope with land. And according to both my grandmother's lore and Uncle Ong's lore about Paul Bunyan, Bessie was also very cognitive. Uh, Bessie could kind of read your thoughts telepathically, sort of thing. And a lot of Uncle Ong's stories about some of the more unusual prehistoric animals were actually telepathic, and had very unusual bugle sounds that they would use to communicate over long distances. So there was a sympathetic relationship between Paul Bunyan and the ox. So after after gold was discovered in California, the West Coast became kind of an explosive hotspot. You know, there was the Indian Removal Act of 1838 that President Jackson put in place. Well, that was adopted in the state of California in 1848, a year before supposed gold was found in 1849. At that point in time, you go to the courthouse, get a writ of action, and you could remove any native human being off of your property with a gunshot. It was open kill zone. We officially recognize 160,000 people here on the West Coast. It was actually over 3 million people that were here, if you included all of the cryptid tribal people, you know, like the Wachugi, the Dogman, the Oma, the Guanche, the Yeren, etc. Nauseam. So at that point, it became an open kill zone. In 1845, there were enough people that had already decided, you know, the land was there and they would just shoot anything. You know, the risky nature of trying to interact from, you know, the cryptid side to us became, it had to be trusted because there were too many people just being outright shot. And that's actually what happened to Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan had befriended one of the logging families and become acquaintance with one of the children, and became very endeared to that particular family because they were always very reciprocal with him, except they were incredibly deceptive. Now, there is a picture floating around the internet of the original Paul Bunyan. It's a picture that my family donated to the Pine Ridge Reservation in 2012. It resembles very similarly this drawing. So, picture is of a man standing next to a boy. I put Betsy in his place because that family was responsible for blowing the brains out of the back of this man's skull. They had called for help, and they told their local indigenous people, another Wachugi man, that they needed to see Paul. They called him Paul Bunyan because he always wore boots, and the shape of his feet they didn't realize were dog's feet. The 11-year-old boy that's standing next to him in that picture was 9 years old when he discovered that Paul Bunyan had dog feet, and he didn't have bunions on his feet at all. And they assumed that he was wearing moccasin boots in order to hide that fact. Well, yeah, actually, that became a policy with some of the more polite cryptid people. They didn't want to scare some people because they realized there was a lot of discrimination against them, so to speak. So this family interacted and lured him, like a redbone person does. Gained his trust, and then they killed him. They put him on public display. The runner stick that he brought and the bag of goods that he had, they took the bag of goods. They also killed Bessie, I mean. They pinned him in an upright position on an old stump. They chained him in with cording, metal cording, pinned it in place with railroad tie iron, nails. They shoved the runner stick through his hand and up through the back of his skin on the back of his hand to prop him upright, make him look good for the picture. And there was no damage to his face because they literally, his father, the young man's father, cross shot him through the back of the skull. The whores of the town donated their hair pieces to cover his genitalia because they thought he was such a rude beast. My grandmother said there were 8 of them that did that. So there's a little piece of real history for you. So I'm going to answer a few questions. And then you can decide whether or not you want to continue being a member of my channel. Because from now on, you're going to get more and more stories like this. I'm going to flat out tell you every single truth I was ever told, and you are not going to like hearing them. Let me back up. Hey, Dark Side. I'm from Oregon. I was born here. World War II, yeah, well, both my parents lived through World War II. My mother volunteered to be a Air Force WAC. She had to stretch herself 1 inch in order to join. She went from 5'8" to 5'9", so she could be a member of our military forces. My father was part of the 40th Sunset Division, Army man, served in the South Pacific. Respectively, my father was born in 1917, my mother was born in 1924. And I was a late life baby. I was the last of 4 children born in the 60s. I don't need a med kit. I know how to medicate anything I need out in the woods. I know what aspartame is. I know what miner's lettuce is. Do you? Hey, Phil. The sleeping area, I know it is common for Sasquatch to poop in the same spot. No, that's only the Gugway. Especially in water. Typically, Bigfoot poo wherever they need to poo. It's only those creatures that like to mark their territory, especially where they eat. That's a problem with the red bone people. They defile themselves in a lot of ways. I have a nuclear radiation detector reading 0. Yeah, well, then you got some, what do they call it? Environmental pollutants. Banana will set a Geiger counter off about like that. I actually set off a Geiger counter at 3.6 because my mother was given a plutonium pill at the end of the war. And if you don't know what plutonium pills are or experimental plutonium, go look up the history of the Air Force. You'll find out that a lot of the women at the end of World War II were poisoned with plutonium pills so that their children would be born deformed or dead, especially if they happen to be Native American. Hey Phil, I wore a St. Christopher's for years, many years, patron saint of safe journeys, yes, and travels. He actually was well known during his life for assisting the lame, the elderly, and children. He would secure them, carry them across rivers. He would secure them during times of flood, and he would do whatever he could in order to help the people around him. And that's actually the nature of most cryptids that are good in nature. Those that follow their white wolf, their good wolf, their good heart, they all take care of us. They interact with us. They are polite, not rude, and they will stand to protect us against things that are harmful, like the red bone people. So it was very disheartening when I was a child to hear the true story of Paul Bunyan. It it's a pity, that we treat things that don't look like us in such a manner, and that's been common through recent history. Last few hundred years, it's been really bad for that sort of thing. Hey, Cosmic, what exactly is the native origin story for the sky coyote, and why the coyote? It is widely known that trickster coyotes can shapeshift. Is that indicative of coyote being in cahoots with dogmen? Now, it might actually be referring to how they test you. So when I was living in a yurt down in Douglas County on private property for 7 months between November of 2019 and May of 2020, the mountain dogman in that area was a shunka oak, a descendant of one of the Egyptian, inhabitants, probably from the prehistory Ice Age era. And they have very strict rules about interacting. You have to match up. You can't be scared. Even if they are right next to you, you have to have the ability to stand fast and be steady and to threaten them. If they threaten you, threaten them back. It's their way of being polite. It's where they decide whether or not you're worth interacting with. So if you run, you balk, you scream, you cry, they'll think you're a fool and they won't want anything to do with you. They will not teach you. They will not trade with you. They will not give you anything. They will not take anything from you. They will not help you in any way. But if you stand your ground like I did, then you get a very good relationship with them. And they are very reciprocal. They will keep you informed of news. They will keep you informed of danger. They will stand in defense of you against a predator animal like he did. He killed a black bear in order to protect the people living on that property. There was the property owner, myself, and another family, because it was a large piece of property. And when the bear kept coming in too close to the house, to all of the houses, and rooting up trees and getting into the gardens and making an absolute nuisance of itself, and we could not remove it because it had a female and it had an offspring. We couldn't get a tag for it. But the Shilka Oak dogman, he took care of it when he saw that it was too dangerous, and I'd built a good relationship with him, and he knew I would stand my ground even against a bear if I had to. He removed it from the property for us for safety reasons. Sovereign, true. I remember hearing that California has the most tribal tribes compared to the rest of the states. I wondered if that also counted for indigenous cryptid tribes. Yes, actually it did. According to my grandmother, she said approximately 3.5 million people were on the West Coast, 1600s to mid 1800s. And there were some rivalries here and there. There were some bad interactions, and there were still some giants, kind of like the Lovelock giants, fish people and that sort of thing, still living in some regions in Northern California and in Southern Oregon, and actually in this valley, the Willamette Valley actually had a large giant population at one point in time during those eras before they got genocided out. And that's actually what happened to a majority of all of the cryptids. It didn't matter if they were friendly or not. Once the Indian Removal Act was in place, it was open war. It became, oh, I have a pest animal on my property. I've seen this. I need a writ of notice to kill them. Yay, it's a family of 30. I don't care. Let's blow them away. So the population that was reported, 163, 164,000-ish, we had far more people here than that because they don't ever count the cryptids. And according to my grandmother, instead of two or 300 tribes, we had over 1,600 tribes here on the West Coast. And many of them had their own separate languages and their own separate trading routes. That's why when you look at the trading routes of the Northwestern Territories, they're crisscrossed. They follow a lot of the modern roadways, actually, or are very close to a lot of the modern roadways because, well, all the settlers did was just follow the trade routes that were already here. We had massive roadways. Some were paved with, rock stone from the rivers, but a lot of them were just dirt trails that were always used, so they were hard packed. And, they'd run for sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of miles. That's why Native people would train to run. Before I went on my turnout, I had to prove that I could I had to prove that I could run 10 miles with no water and carry 20 pounds of goods, or my mother wouldn't have let me go out on my turnout because I was required to do a 10-mile loop every day to go collect food and prove that I could sustain myself. And I had to bring anywhere between 10 and 20 pounds of goods with me, and there was no water in the desert. If you didn't carry it with you, you had to suck on a rock, which is actually what I did. It's part of my training was to learn to remoisturize your mouth by not opening your mouth. You suck on a rock, so you always have saliva. You don't blink. You train yourself not to blink. That's part of the reason why I always have red eyes, because I have dry eye syndrome, because I don't freaking blink enough because of my training. And, I wasn't allowed to stop. Once I got up in the morning, I had a certain amount of time that she would allow me to have uh, each day to go make that loop and bring her dinner and me breakfast. If I wanted to spend the night, I had to earn it. Otherwise, I slept in the desert. So when you're a runner and you're running, between, let's say you were a runner that ran between Eugene, Oregon and Portland, that's 157 miles. How long is that going to take you? I know that it took my father, and you're not going to believe this, but he would swim from Newberg, Oregon to Springfield, Oregon. That's also 157 miles. Upriver, towing his empty boat with a rope lasso around his shoulders. It took him 3 days to swim upriver, 157 miles. He would spend one night on Island Park, little island over there, because that was his base camp for the end of his trapping route. And then he would float back down the river, collect all of his traps, reset them, and collect the goods from them, the animals, and float home in 3 days. And then he would hand the mink over, the boatload of mink, to his parents, who would finish skinning and prepping the hides and getting them ready for either tanning or sale or freezing them for, later sale, etc. That was my father's life until he was recruited for the military by draft. And he started the original trap route when he was 10 years old. And the first 50 miles was all he worked when he was 10. And it expanded to 157 miles until he was 15, and he was strong enough to tow the boat that far. That is the kind of people that were our pioneer people. That was regular habit and daily practice for many trappers. If they didn't row their boat up a river, they swam it up a river. He actually used a traditional birch bark canoe to do most of that in because it was lightweight. They're only about 80 pounds if they're built, correctly with the right kinds of wood. So you can very easily tow a very lightweight boat like that upriver. And that was very common 100 so years ago now. That was still how people lived. What they did as a daily chore in some cases was bizarrely strength requiring stuff. There wasn't the heavy machinery that we have now. There weren't power motors. All of everything that we did was hand done. We had a few vehicles, We had steam engines for trains. We had a few gas-driven vehicles at that time. We still had steam-driven buckboards that were originally created in like the 1840s because of the gold rush. Need to get around town. Um, and if you go look at old McCall's catalogs, original McCall's catalogs, you'll find all of those goods for sale because all you had to do was drop a letter with a check or a gold piece in it to the company of origin that you wanted the product from, give them the order number from the book, and they would ship it to you on a train. In fact, a lot of the original homes in this valley were shipped here as kit houses that were from McCall's catalog. I have a friend who owns one, the old Fillmore house. And a lot of the other original homes in this particular valley were kit homes. They were manufactured back east and sent out west. So we don't have a very good understanding of even what was going on in the 1920s, let alone what was going on in the 1800s. So, start cracking books. You're going to need them because I'm going to be dumping a lot of history out that is probably going to be upsetting to some people. Yeah. Hey, Whiskey. I'm scrolling through lives. I just wanted to tell you I like the artwork. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I like this piece too, actually. It's spiritual to me. Uh, I hope your weekend goes well too, Whiskey. And feel free to hang out some. Hey, Phil. Thank you. Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad that you guys enjoy my content. And I'm sorry, a bit passionate about. I'm I'm passionate about what I do because I've had actually a very incredible life when I think about it. I got to meet my first cryptid when I was 2, and that was Uncle Ong, my dad's friend, that actually swam across the Willamette River over there at Island Park to check on him because somebody shot his hat off his head when he was 15. It was kind of a turf war, so to speak, over trapping areas. One didn't like the other. It wasn't uncommon in those days. You know, we hadn't even really hit the Roaring Twenties yet, or 30s, 40s, World War II, and we hadn't really. I mean, we'd started to industrialize, but the West Coast was still pretty pioneer-oriented, still kind of Wild West-ish. I mean, my grandmother knew a man who had been a sheriff during the 1870s, and he still carried his revolver as a citizen in California, even after retirement. Colt, all the way up into the 30s. It wasn't uncommon to be armed in public, and it, you know, wasn't uncommon to need to be because there was still a lot of cougar and bear and et cetera, and people's mindset were still in very protective nature. Now we're very citified, and any kind of talk about a boomstick is, oh my God, you shouldn't talk about it. Well, don't go walking in the woods around here. 2 miles up the road, there are bear warnings and cougar warnings. And, I've got power and water and garbage that comes to my door and my mail, but, I go 3 miles up the hill, I could get eaten by something. So, not to be armed is kind of stupid. So, we do have a bad history with, what do they call it? Some sort of destiny thing. Uh, what they really mean is might makes right. If you can kill your enemy, you can trick your enemy, you can deceive your enemy and destroy them, then that's what you do. And I'm sorry, but that's very red bone people in attitude. And I do kind of see our culture in the same sort of prehistory way because there are some people that are just born evil and all they do is evil. They always nurse their dark wolf. They always do evil to their neighbors. They always lie. They always cheat. They always steal. To me, that's just a descendant of a red bone person in my mind, because it's actually a potential. It is actually a potential. Because there are plenty of Native Americans who were crossbred, and there have been, historically people throughout history in other parts of the world who are crossbreeds with cryptids and may or may not know that. Some countries still know they're crossbreeds, some don't. China and the Yeren boy, for instance, that was in the 50s, 60s. And that was a modern case of a cryptid mating with an individual and producing an offspring that didn't look or act like potentially either of the parents. That's not unheard of in, native lore. It was quite common actually, because we did have marriage relationships. We did have social interactions with them. We relied on them for our goods. We relied on them for many things. And, at the end of the Ice Age, when everything started to melt again, that was about 30,000 years ago, we had already had kind of a regrowth, a reconnection between Africa, the Egyptians, and us. The Shunkauk dogmen came roughly 38,000 years ago from Egypt here to help us because we had gone through an extended drought on this side of the planet. Now, that could be because of solar radiation. There could have been all kinds of factors. I'm not sure exactly why, because there was no memory of it. No story that gave a defined answer other than the land dried up and was no longer fertile. So I'm not sure the reason. And Uncle Long didn't go into details of it, though he had plenty of details about other things. That particular event, I don't know if it was why it was caused. So, uh, during the end of the Ice Age, the Shulko came. They supplied us with grain and hard goods, olives, that sort of thing. And there actually were some transplanted plants. They brought olive trees, for instance, and dates at one point in time were all up and down this coastline when we started to warm up again a bit. And when the ice age started to recede, about 15,000 years ago or so, our dog people, the Shunkauk, uh, found our Fertile Crescent area, the Illinois area. It's what my grandmother called the old bread basket, because it was the origin point, that major riverway area around St. Louis, Philadelphia. Those locations was much like the Fertile Crescent in the Mideast, between the Tigris and the Tibers. It had a lot of floodplains, it had a lot of high yield for plants, and it preserved its moisture longer than any other area. So when the dogmen came, they helped us relearn how to fertilize that area and how to make it a bread basket again. And that's what revitalized Cahokia for a while after the Ice Age, because though we had forgotten about that culture here, we had to be retaught it by dogmen who came here. And then they reintroduced us to the location and told us the history of our own ancestors and helped us recapitulate that land into a fertile growth area. It's where a lot of our planting began here in the Americas. It's where we grew corn, maize, and where we grew grains. And that's how we supplied, our tribes. And we would run bags of goods or sleds of goods in the event of South America. They had a stone sled system with stone roadways that had been utilized throughout ancient times and even into more modern times, because many of those uh, original stone structures stayed in place very well and did not wear out even with earthquakes and natural disasters and that sort of thing. They had a certain level of stability that maintained for several hundred years, if not thousands. And that's how we would transport goods, in certain areas. Or we would do it by boat or raft. That was still, you know, what we conceive of as goods transport today was still the same then, maybe using slightly different tools, but still the same. And then, when you look at some of the South American cultures, they build reed-boats just like, the reed people in South America build reed-boats just like the reed-boats in the Delta region of uh, Egypt. And the Delta culture actually builds their homes out of reeds, and the reed structures in that area are very similar to what Uncle Ong described as being the reed houses during his reincarnation dream era, 157,000 million, 150,000, let's see, 147 million years ago. And that is in Southern Oregon here. So in that era, we had a very flourishing, warm state of existence. So part of the reason why we lost some of our cultures was the amount of loss because of the advancing glacial system. It covered like 70% of the planet on both sides, top and bottom. And then, once we started to revitalize between 30,000 and about 12,000 years ago, then we were hit by the end of the Dryas period. We were hit by a fragmenting comet that was made up of calcium carbonate. And the explosion pattern of that particular comet was across the Pacific, out into the Pacific as far as the Hawaiian Islands, up into Lower Canada, Upper Mexico, through the Panama Canal area, across up through the Hudson Bay area, over through the East Coast and off the tip of, New York, Rhode Island area. That was the splatter effect of that, comet rain. It destroyed almost everything on this side of the planet again, just as we were starting to come back out of, the end of the Ice Age and the Great Drought. So, that's part of the reason why we had massive floods during that time. That's why a lot of, bone evidence and home evidence and any kind of physical evidence, tool evidence, some of it's very, very displaced. It's not where it should be. You know, it's because, you get hit by hundreds of thousands of tons of material for several days or several hours in a row. And it just obliterates everything. It creates massive lake systems. It created bays, so if that's the case, then, we were pretty well wiped out again. So, Cahokia has gone through a lot. It was destroyed again during that time too, because Cahokia was kind of at the center of that mass when the comet broke up. It started in this Pacific Western area, but the majority of it broke between the Rockies and the Midwest. That was right over Cahokia. It destroyed that city again. So there's that. And we don't think when we're looking at ancient cities that those ancient cities are habitually built in the same spot. But you can take Pompeii as an example of, a city under a volcano that has been rebuilt like 27 times in a row, several hundred years apart, or sometimes a couple hundred years apart, or thousands, I mean, because the mountain does not always erupt. Vesuvius does not erupt on a regular basis, though it does have regularity. It's actually part of a set of supervolcanoes throughout the Mediterranean area. Kind of like our Yellowstone Park. They have 3 massive supers around the Med. So those are things to be taken into consideration too. A lot of our modern findings might be also on ancestral findings that we are unaware of. And that might be because we've never done soundings, or it might be because those lower cities have been so completely destroyed. And that was also one of the reasons why we would uh, go through the shell of the earth. We would go through the old tunnel systems. My uncle Ong described, you know, during the prehistory before the ice age, we had tunnel systems that had been dug by massive creatures, giant moles and sloths and other things that inhabited the ground, and that we would, as those animals died off, we started utilizing their tunnel systems as travelways. Uh, a lot of what we understand as modern cave systems were probably originally really ancient animal dens in some cases, or formations that were caused because of erosion that they also inhabited. And that's potentially why there are some very unusual cryptids in some caves, because they're probably still old tunnel systems from ancient animals that have been habitually inhabited. And we probably don't know that anymore because the lore is gone. Let me see if there are any more questions. Hey Bill, Canada has 199 native languages. Maybe that is only BC. Yeah, uh, native languages here in America were much like the Mandarin languages of China. There are like 27 major dialects. That's why they had to standardize their language. The Asiatic languages were so partitioned. Our Native American languages were very partitioned too. And to me, that says, they're very isolated as to tribe, meaning indigenous culture, and that they probably go back further in history than we realize, because the more expansive a culture is, the more unified a language becomes. It becomes necessary to adopt, certain major languages so everybody can speak to each other. But once culture breaks apart, once, we lose population, our languages become isolated and they become narrowed, and they, you know, are remembrances or dialects of each other. So you'll get multiple languages in an area that may have originally been one cohesive language that over time has broken up. And the other odd thing is, when I find kana that the Bigfoot people put down, the Skakam in particular, will lay down a poem in their classrooms that makes the statement that their language class is the language class of Pinyin 25,000 years. So that's post Ice Age. Now, Pinyin in China has only been known for 5,000 years. So there's no way that language could have come from China. It went to China. Because if they're remembering 25,000 years here, that's 20,000 more years than China's had its version of Pinyin. So again, that puts me back in the camp that the cryptid language is a parent language of some kind. And we may think of it as Asiatic today, but it was probably just a universal language at one point in time. Kind of like English is becoming somewhat internationally universal, like a few other major languages, Spanish, French, German. People, do business, Japanese, Chinese, those languages become popular due to trade. And I'm assuming that the cryptid language was probably the original trading language uh, from pre-Ice Age, and the remnants of it after Ice Age are still being taught today within their known cultures. Because if they can count their language back to 25,000 years ago, that means they probably have post-Ice Age stories and potentially pre-Ice Age stories of their own cultures still being taught within their cultures that we know nothing about except for the few things that native elders and native medicine people have learned from them over the years or still retain as stories. So that's another reason why it's important to preserve lore, because with preserving lore, an understanding of culture and language and what potentially happened before our time. Hey, Amy. Good to see you. Glad you finally caught up with me on Alive. Hey, Ice Dolly. Do you think the world will ever go back to more open interaction between us and cryptids without interruption? Seems hard to believe. Well, I know from Uncle Ong's and my grandmother's stories that our cultures always come back together. It is not always in the best way. It's usually because we've acted like fools and we've forced a separation with our bad behavior. But they will only take their bad behavior so they will only take our bad behavior from us for so long before they put their foots down, because they believe, as many indigenous cultures, they are our parents, they are our elders, and in being elders, they have a right to put us in our places. So that's historically known. I mean, we got put in our places 2,500 years ago by them, 2,700 years ago. Uh, and it was a bloody mess. We didn't win unless we nursed our white wolf and acted like good children. And what's going on in the southern border area right now with the Dog Minute War, that's the beginning. That that's probably going to be the tipping point. We all just don't know it yet. Because that was the warnings of my grandmother's stories and Uncle Ong's stories. We can only push on the cryptid people so long before they correct us and they put an end to our bad behavior and those that behave badly. So if history bears out, then uh, it looks like we may have the beginnings of a clash of cultures, and we're not going to make it unless we mind our P's and Q's and we start uh, abiding by some basic natural laws. Don't kill each other. Have respect for each other. Have babies. Raise babies. Make sure those babies know language and culture and history. Respect your woods. Respect your grasslands. Live naturally. Live in tune with and in harmony with creation and what the Creator has given us. Because that has always been the answer. And once we get too far off into acting like redbone people, taking advantage of each other, stealing from each other, lying about each other, molesting each other, they always come out of the woodwork. The ones with a good heart always put us in our place. And you can talk to any indigenous culture around the world, and you'll find the same thing being said. Their cryptids do the same thing to them. And that's going to be international. It's going to have variations. The story is going to be different. And the cryptids are going to be different, but the overall sense of the story is going to remain the same. That we are always put in place by something that is more powerful than us, and it is our ancestors, it is our loric ancestors that do it to us. And I understand that's potentially coming, and I think that's something that people are not going to be aware of until it knocks on their door, literally. Hey Phil, do cryptids have addiction problems? I don't think so. And the reason why I say that, yeah, I've seen a few that like beer, and they will steal booze. Uh, but they don't have any way of making those kinds of materials themselves. And the stuff that they do utilize, like if they were to take hallucinogenics or anything like that, it's going to be a medicine person's vision quest or a coming of age vision quest. It's going to be as a religious practice and not as an addiction. I know that the cryptids I've been around, with the exception of one or two that I've tracked in my life, I've never seen anything that would suggest that they use a whole lot of drugs of any kind. Though they do like MJ. A lot of the Skookum people will steal that stuff and roll around in it and take it home with them. But they also use it as a medicinal thing. When they're treating their children, if their children are sick and they cannot sleep, they will make them eat that plant. They will give that to them in their food. They'll sedate a child who's got a high fever. They'll, you know, they use most things medicinally. They don't seem to have our kinds of behaviors. It seems it's not relevant to their way of living. In fact, a lot of that kind of behavior is shunned. If one of them becomes a drunkard, they're kind of left on the outside of the party. You know, they're, I don't know about you, you're not acting right. And I've seen that behavior very, very infrequently with alcohol. And there are some history stories about that sort of thing. Like when you read the story of Gilgamesh, uh, how they befriend the giant humanoid that looks like a cryptid Bigfoot. They got him drunk and introduced him to a hooker. Same old classic story. And, when you start researching into the ancient Roman documents and you see how the Liberus, Satyros, and some of the other cryptid people were gathered up, they typically would get them drunk and then they'd tie them up and take them to the Colosseum to fight. And some of them were actually put in training schools and fighting schools and taught to fight and perform. It's once you read like Suetonius and some of the older authors that have Juvenal and some of the authors around Nero's time, you'll discover there are some very interesting accounts about Nero's Golden Army, his 200 men that were guards. They were all actually cryptids. They were freaking Bigfoot in gold armor. And they were also the ones that pulled the sails out over the Colosseum. They had a mooring system that would allow them to pull out great canvases that would provide shade over the arena. And I think there have been a few coins that actually depict that scenario on the coin where the sun shields are drawn over the top of the arena. Basically big moored in sails for shade. But that was all run by cryptids. Cryptids ran around Rome, for God's sakes. For instance, there was a gladiator during Claudius's time, right after Nero, whose father had been freed by Nero, if I remember right. Or no, it was Claudius who freed him. He was a gladiatory fighter. He was a pit fighter, and he was a venator. He fought animals, in particular elephants. The man would wrestle elephants to the ground, and he was a massive Cibros lateros man. He looked like a guanche, a great big gorilla. Some of the descriptions say he was between 12 and 15 feet in height. I don't think he was that big, but who knows? He was big enough supposedly to wrestle elephants. So he was freed for a battle against an elephant that refused to fight him. They were actually both freed, and the cryptid man was given, citizenship of Rome. He actually managed, supposedly, to find some woman he could marry and have children with. I don't know how that's possible, unless his junk was small. But they had an offspring named Proculus. Proculus became another gladiator, another venator fighter, an animal fighter in the Colosseum of Rome. And he employed such devices as merry-go-rounds, teeter-totters, and that sort of thing in order to put on a big performance, because he was also very acrobatic. He had exceedingly long limbs and a very short torso, and he was famously known for being able to jump over a lion or tiger run across the Colosseum, and as the animal chased him, he would run up the Colosseum wall and flip over behind the animal to get the advantage on it. And that was described, I think, in some of Suetonius's works at the time. So when you start getting into Latin translations, or you read Latin and can read these stories, you find some very interesting information. And it's nothing like what we expect. I think that's actually the reason why 73% of Latin texts are not translated into English. It's because the universities don't want us to know that particular history, because that tells a lot about what happened in Rome alone, let alone some of the stories from ancient Greece. There are a lot of stories about cryptids in ancient times, and it doesn't matter which textual document you go to or which culture. They all have incredibly interesting stories when you finally are able to read them. Ayastale, do you think the world... Oh, sorry. I just answered that. And then I went on. Oh, really, Amy? You grew up around Hudson River and you found interesting tools as a kid. Yeah, I've found some very, very interesting around the waterways here. You'll find tool washout areas in a lot of the rivers and streams and connector rivers and whatnot in this area, and you'll find anything from really interesting Clovis points that are made out of agate uh, to uh, I found flint that's striped flint, green and tawny colored flint, napped pieces. I've found basalt pieces. I've found large granite pieces. And I have been told by some of the rock collectors from Oregon that there's actually a deposit of diorite tools uh, in a border region with Idaho on eastern Oregon, Pendleton area. Somewhere over there, there's a massive field with diorite tools, knapp tools all over it. I would love to be able to see those. Some of them are supposedly quite massive. They're, arrowheads the size of your palm, axes the length of your forearm, spear tips also the length of your forearm. I would love to see tools like that, because that would suggest, stories of giants or stories of giant people or cryptids of some kind making tools like that because they have the strength to. I would love to see some of that. Um, a lot of the people that have told me about them, they say no, there's still cryptids in the area. That's why I don't pick up the tools. I'm like, well, just ask permission. You have to ask, or trade for them. But just to be able to take pictures of them, see them, measure them, expose people to them, that would be quite a thing to do. So there are tons of different kinds of tools you can be finding in waterways and around waterways. So a lot of battlegrounds that have tools in them because, they don't pick them up after a battle. I know of an area around Avila Beach, California, where there were some pioneer battles and native battles and multiple native battles between two particular tribes around that area. And there are literally tools and skeletal remains to this day in the hillside, that area. You'll be walking along and kick up a human bone. It's not uncommon in that particular hillside, but a lot of people don't know about it, thankfully, because they probably go up there and raid it. But you know, we've had a lot of life living here, so there's always a lot of evidence around. Emojis are just drawings. I'm sorry, Amy. So, Phil, don't be so hard on people. Not everyone can take it. Hey, World Bigfoot. How you doing? Hey, Cosmic. Do both Sasquatch and Dogman use reeds to build structures? My most recent upload is a structure of mixed tree branches and reeds, bamboo, trying to figure out what type of cryptid builds these. Wow. I know my Uncle Long said that bamboo and reed was something that was very common to use uh, during his reincarnation dream. Uh, Grandmother, what did she say? She said there were reed people here in the Northwest. And it was the reason why the Nootka people wove a domed shaped hat, and the reason why they made a cedar bark and or reed uh, shawl was to hide the fact that they were in cryptid areas. It was so they could forage and gather and not be disturbed. And those were, mm, there was a specific name for the tribe near them that were cryptids. Sig, Sigdal, Sigdalic. They were, I don't even think she described them as. She said a lot of them were red haired, both in body hair, and they were kind of like the urine. They had, kind of humanoid facial features. And they used a lot of reed. They built, she said they built circular houses out of bent reed. And they made a woven structure, and then they would lay the bundle reed or shaft of reed up over the top and pin them in with crooked sticks. But they were one of the tribes that was wiped out, supposedly here in the Northwest. And I think they're part of the Skookum family lines. Uh, they may be in other locations. There may still be survivors that are unknown of. And they're probably part of the more Bigfoot-like people that are more friendly to us. I don't believe that the dogmen use reeds. I know they use bundles of sticks sometimes, and they will use a bunch of small woven sticks to make a basket up in a tree or a basket on the ground. Trying to think which other ones I've been told about. Because there are, in Northern California, there was fern people, and they used century ferns to build a lot of their structures out of. And I have seen some structures like that when I was a child, and they basically look like an upside down basket, but not covered with normal stuff, covered with sword fern, not sword fern, but the century fern that looks very lacy. And they preferred working with the dry stalks, and they would make a willow circle, and then they would make loops over the top, and then they would lace the century fern in between the other woven material to make a secure roof that was safe from rain, and they would pack the sides with moss. I don't know if your structures look anything like that, but those were more cousin families with the Skookum in the year, and the more humanoid-looking wild people. And I don't know what tribe it might be, but it sounds like some of the stuff my grandmother described. I just can't remember the particular tribe's names. It's been a very, very long time. But I do know they were cousins with the Skuckamaniran types. They were intermarried with those groups and they traded with those groups. Like the dogmen here uh, in the West Coast were known by two different kinds of cultural identity names. They were called moss men because they would make wood structures on the ground and then pack them with moss to insulate them. And they would also be called hayseed people or the grass man because they would make round homes out of grass. It's the way my grandmother described it. And from how she how she explained it is they would take large stands of tall grass. They would bend the grass over itself. They would pin the grass into place like a big sleeping bag with little sticks and whatnot. And then they would line the bed of it with more grass, and they would climb into those to sleep at night and hide themselves from people because they were low to the ground and completely inconspicuous. They look like a lump, doesn't look like anything. Oh, yeah, thank you for that, Cosmic. That's a great breakdown of how some of those tunnels were built. I expect the same. Well, there are even stories like in the Mid East. Uh, some some of the older cultures, smaller tribal cultures, still have stories about big animals making some of our tunnel systems, especially ones that are closer to the surface. And that, over time they've become sandstone or they become petrified instead of just soil. So, that's a possibility because of mineralization. But that would still put, even tunnels like that, it takes approximately 50,000 years for mineralization to happen unless you've got an incredibly mineral rich area. I mean, there are a few springs, for instance, in the world that will petrify wood in a few months. But without that heavy mineralization exchange, it takes approximately 50,000 years for most things to mineralize. So any structure that you would find that might be a potential burrow is from 50 million years ago, or 50,000 years ago, I mean. Uh, that would be middle of the Ice Age, uh, you know, middle end of it. Well, a lot of the baskets that I have seen, uh, Cosmic, what shapes are the baskets woven into, circular or square? I have seen both types. So the skookum in the redwoods, the ones that have the little bump on top of their head like a bun, those people actually build a very peculiar bed. First time I ever saw one, I thought somebody had built it. So they build a lattice work around the edge like a little fence, and it'll be about 20 inches tall. So they'll stick sticks in the ground, and then they'll weave material like lath material in between. So it makes a little, oval-shaped bed that's about 12 feet long, about 4 or 5 feet across. Then they'll lay in little fine sticks and other little material, sword fern, and they'll insulate it with moss. And then the top layer is usually 4 or 5 inches of really soft, squishy moss. And the beds are really springy. They're actually very comfortable. And then yes, I played in one when I was a kid because I was in the area and I was curious. And the young ones, they'll make a similar kind of old bed that's got the little fence around it that's built up, but they also make an upside down basket that's an oval basket that's completely encased that they put over the bed to secure their young from coyote attack at night, because they're aware that coyotes will, hunt when there's available prey. And for some reason, coyotes have a tendency to go after cryptid children. They go after Bigfoot babies. They go after all of their children. So a lot of what they do to secure their children is make a kind of capsule that keeps them safe, a little cage, a baby gate to keep the coyotes out. But it's usually a little dome, and it's made out of, willow or some other straight material that's good and strong. And they make it small enough that, the holes between a coyote or a dog couldn't get their head through. And then sometimes during rainy seasons, they'll put material over the top, ferns and bark and whatnot, to keep the rain off of the young ones. And then the Yaren, they build a kind of a cornucopia bed. It looks like a big flat based uh, bunch of woven sticks, and it will be completely encased. It will have one hole at the end that's large, and occasionally you'll have another hole at the opposite end. And that's another thing you'll see, especially with like little baby structures. You'll typically find a little hole in the top. I think it's a breather hole because they get really warm. So the Aaron's beds look like a big cornucopia basket in some cases. And during the winter, they'll close that larger end down so it looks like a great big mummy bag made out of sticks and woven material. And then they'll cover the tops over with bark, and inside they'll either use, soft leaves, soft bark. If there are a lot of fleas or other issues in the area, they'll put in um, cedar bark, the inner bark that's really soft to keep bugs off of them. And they always have kind of a matting underneath whatever kind of bed they make on the ground to elevate them a good at least 6, 8, 10 inches off the ground. And that, my mother explained to me, was to keep snakes, scorpions, and other dangerous woodland creatures off of you, because they'll crawl through a bed like that, but they won't crawl over. They'll crawl under you to get warm, and you'll have the safety of the protection of, a layer of material that separates you from the poisonous creature that could hurt you. And they won't crawl over the top of you, they'll go underneath you, and they'll stay in that kind of little stick situation. So it's part of the reason why cryptids build their beds with a layer of sticks. It's to keep dangerous creatures away from them, like rattlesnakes and scorpions, because you don't have any anti venom. If you get bit, you have to go through it, and if you're very young, you may not live through a bite like that, especially from like a timber rattler. The Some timber rattlers get up to 6, 8 feet long up here, and when they get that big, they're pretty dangerous as far as their venom goes, because the poison sacs are larger, not because they, hit you with all of it, but they definitely do have, you can die from a timber rattler, kind of like you can die from a sidewinder bite, uh, and especially if you're younger or if you have a health issue. So because they have no antivenom, they have to find other ways to protect themselves from those kinds of creatures. So that's, I think, the reason, according to my family lore, hereditary lore, that's the reason why their beds are built up off of the ground or in layers that separate them. And you also have the warmth factor. The more separation you get from cold ground, you create a warm space under you, keeps you from getting hypothermia. Yeah, World of Bigfoot. I'm siding with Sasquatch. More trustworthy. Yeah, me too. I think they've got a more noble personality than we have. Cosmic. What you mentioned about Dogman coming from Egypt is interesting. Is that the true origin of dogmen? Or how does Anubis factor in? I've been kind of wondering about that myself. I Uncle Ong had stories about Egypt. He claimed that when the Gaza Plateau was first created, that area was rich with jungle. And the primary people that lived there were the dogmen, the Shulka'unk. And they are the ones that built the pyramids, supposedly according to my Uncle Ong. But it wasn't until after uh, they decided they needed them, which was a very funny way of putting it. But it was during the time that we were becoming international. We were beginning to need power. It was on our upswing of technology. So I think it went back historically quite far and far before the Ice Age. Uh, our Ice Age beginning was about 115,000 years ago. So it would have been during the Pleistocene era, which would put it back almost 3 million. Um, and if that is true, then that entire continent had a completely different thing going on. It was a flourishing continent. It didn't have a lot of deserts, um, and all of that northern region, according to Uncle Ong, all down into the Berber area, all through the Delta region, all through what we modernly know as Egypt, that was all dog people. And their first leaders were memorialized. The Sphinx, that has a human face now, it had a lion face at one point in time, but originally, according to my Uncle Ong, it was actually a dog man. It was a representation of a dog man, because the dingoes in the area, what we understand as an Egyptian dingo, uh, was very similar in nature, uh, according to my Uncle Ong, as the dog people were, the ones that stood upright. You know, the funny thing about an Egyptian dingo is you can approach them in the wild. You can get within 10 or 15 feet of them and feed them, and they will not attack you. Um, it was that calm nature, it was that trusting nature that they memorialized in the original Sphinx. And it supposedly originally did not have a body or legs, it was just like a bust statue from the shoulders up, and it was just the shoulders and head of a dog person. It wasn't until later generations that the other structures came about after they began to technologically advance and they required power, which is when they started leveling their jungles and destroying their area and you know scraping down to the lime bedstone so that they could build their power plants, uh, according to Uncle Long anyway. Hey, live up. Okay, so Ice Dolly, have you ever investigated the tracks outside of U.S.? Um, yeah, when I was living in Canada on Vancouver Island for a couple of years, I tracked a dogman up there and a couple of Bigfoot, and there's quite an extensive population actually on Vancouver Island, especially up around the Nanaimo area. And even in the southern point where it's quite populated, you could still find a lot of evidence. And in fact, I lived in an apartment building up there that had a dog man that would go through it. Everybody in the apartment building that knew about it knew not to be outdoors or out in the hallway, certain times of night because the flipping dog man would run through the building. And sometimes he'd run back through in the middle of the night and wake you up. He really liked to go through the second and third floor. And he'd time it. It was a secured building. You had to have a key to get into either end, and you had to punch a code in to get into the front door or have somebody let you in. So he'd come down the hillside, he'd cross the roadway, he'd wait in the bushes at the end of the building where the entryway was. One of the people would go in, and he would hop up over as the door was closing. He'd hold the door open, so that it didn't completely close. Let the person go on into their apartment, and then as soon as it was safe, he would step inside and he would walk from one end of the building to the other. Probably because it was warm and dry, and it was on his way down to the coastline where he would go and catch fish. And I actually opened my door one night to make sure what I was being told was actually the truth because several of my neighbors had told me there is a dog man that walks this building at night. Don't mess around with it because it will come and mess around with you. So one night when I heard it running through the second floor hallway and I heard the door, security door open at the end through the staircase to go out, I opened my door to take a look at him, and he was about a 7 foot tall, jet black dog man with a tail and very humanoid looking upper body, very wide shoulders like a human, not collapsed shoulders like a bear person. It had the back legs of a dog, the feet of a dog, the little hook leg, the whole bit. A very shepherdy looking fluffy tail that was about down to his knees. Very sharp pointed shepherd ears. And when he noticed me, that I was looking out my door at him, he immediately kind of went, oh really? Let the door close, turned back around, came down the hallway at me. And I waited until he was about 20 feet away, maybe 15 feet, before I closed and locked the door because I wanted to get a really good look at him. He looked pretty much like the mountain dog man that do the picture of that had the face paint on. He looked just like the ones down here and acted kind of the same way. He looked through my peephole, he scratched on the door, he tried to growl at me to intimidate me, and I basically gave him the same gruff back. Yeah, okay, come through the door. You're not gonna do it. You know, he threatened me, I threatened him. He kind of went, huh, okay. And, he finally went on. But we had an exchange for a couple of minutes between the door and I and him, looking through the peepholes at each other. It was very interesting. But, neighbors had that problem with him. He would try to intimidate you to keep you in your house so that he could pass without being bothered. And the cleaning lady for that building would always bitch about having to clean up after him because he never wiped his feet off. Then occasionally you would see massive tracks, kind of like the inky dog tracks from one of my videos, but they were in mud down through the hallway. So the carpets were always needing to be cleaned, and occasionally he'd either scratch something on the wall or he'd leave muddy handprints on the wall. So the cleaning lady was always complaining about him. Okay. So, Cosmic, do you happen to know if the heart shape is a clan symbol or part of a paleo language, or which cryptids use this? Well, all of the cryptids that are more friendly and more human-like actually use a stone heart as a gift in marriage. So when cryptids get married, they will either chip or find a heart that is in the shape have a heart. And the wife will give a heart to her husband, and the husband will give a heart to his wife because they do not remarry. They only marry once in their lives. If their mate dies, they don't remarry. And that heart is a symbol stating that they have a stone heart against all intruders and that they will remain faithful to their marriage throughout the course of their lives. When their mate dies, they will put that stone heart in a memorial area so that they're still remembered within the culture and within the society. And then, the children will place the final parent's heart on that same memorial wall. So that is the meaning of the heart. That is their way of marrying. It's like a wedding ring. Well, the mating habits that we have, actually. Main mermaid. What cryptids are taking people and why? Food, mates. Thank you. I suspect that some of the people that are disappearing are probably being taken as food, and they're probably being taken by red bone people. Those that have always practiced either cannibalism or dark rituals. So your descendants of giants, your 6 foot, 6-fingered, 7-toed, etc. giants. That into people, the Gugway people, those people that like to enslave and capture and destroy things. Uh, I think that's potentially what's going on with the majority of that. There are some cases of adoption, though, where, good cryptids that are kind will take people in. There was an incident in 92, 93 with a friend of mine that visited from Canada, and we had all, a group of us had gone out to play capture the flag in one of the local forests here. And during that game, my friend kind of got sat down by a cryptid who wanted him to be a brother of his, wanted him to come and live with his cryptid family. This, they'd invited this human being because of the facial structure of him. They thought, you know, the cryptid man thought, "You are a brother of mine. I recognize you. You need to know your lore. Come live with us. I will tell you your lore and our family lore, and I will teach you our ways." And my friend refused. He said, "I've got to be to work on Monday." But, I do have one picture of a potential human being in an area with cryptids. So there is a potential for also some people going missing because they want to know their lore, they want to know their history, and they go back to the parent people, what we understand as our origin people. So it's uncommon these days, but it does still happen. I mean, I'm adopted by a pair, but I don't have to go anywhere, they come to me. But for an individual who wants to separate themselves from society and wants to learn a new way, yeah, some cryptids will take you in and do that. But others will definitely eat you. And that's part of what needs to be understood. That's part of what needs to be back in our common, primary understanding. Not everything looks alike. Not everything is the same. And some of them are dangerous. And you can delineate by particular behaviors or where they live. Sometimes it's because they are cave dwellers. A lot of the ones that are not cool are cave dwellers, and those are the ones you really need to avoid in most cases because a lot of them are incredibly cannibalistic or carnivorous. And that's your crawlers, that's your face eaters, face peelers, some of the remnant giants that are still around, because there have been stories from some of the native Alaskan people that I know that they've seen some pretty big creatures that look pretty much like human beings, no hair, but are giant, standing 30, 40 feet. You can look at their shoulder from a ridgeline kind of thing, you know, and that's modern supposed sightings. That's within the last 15, 20 years. I would assume those sorts of things that are cave dwellers that live in incredibly remote areas or incredibly deep within the earth will occasionally come up and snack on us for dinner. And then you also have to consider, the stories of the thunderbird. Thunderbirds aren't all just a big modern bird. Some of the thunderbirds are specifically talking about pterosaurs and pterodactyls, which are supposed to be extinct. But Montana is full of them because of the massive cave systems over there. Pterodactyls live in caves. They dig burrows in the ground, and they live in burrows that go several hundred feet down. And their exit holes are usually out the sides of ridge lines. So there's also that. If you find some of the 411 cases, an individual disappears with no foot track, no trace, no nothing, and then you find the body months or years later up in a high parapet area. To me, that screams something with wings picked that individual up, ate them somewhere else, and left the bones where they fed on them. And that would be very archaic behavior, dino behavior, pterosaur behavior, or pterodactyl behavior. Because there are even caves here in Oregon that have those kinds of cryptids in them, and I've been eyewitness to that a couple of times in my life. And there are other cave systems with other cryptids that you wouldn't believe are still alive, but are. And they're just unidentified species from really ancient times. Excuse me. I need a little bit of tea. I was smoking a lot today. And I think I might might have to take a break for a second. Though I can't. There's also some cryptids that might still practice very ancient religions too, that might require eating a person or killing a person as a sacrifice. But again, that's all the all the red bone people. It's that dark nature, dealing with black medicine, dark medicines, dark behavior, eating each other, predating off of each other, using each other as a thing instead of excuse me, using a person as a thing instead of respected another individual. That's the key factor. And the cryptids that respect you and want to interact with you and be polite with you, you can trust. It's being able to identify the red bone people, though, that's key. Those are your skinwalkers, which are typically only on the Navajo reservation, because it's actually a particular set of cave dwellers that have been there for generations. Navajo are very aware of them. They've been there for hundreds of years. Or some of your shapeshifters that are gaining that ability by dark practices instead of meditation and education, learning. A lot of the Buddhistic thought that you can levitate or that you can disappear or that you can walk through walls, that's all actually real. It's just training your mind, training your body, toning your energy, toning your aura, and allowing you your own reality to go, oh, I ignore this, so it's possible. I can do this because it's part of what I am as a human being. That's something that the Sabe understand. That's part of their, oh my gosh, my allergies are just killing me today. I can't, oh, I would like to not ever have allergies. I didn't have allergies until I was 24, and I've had them ever since, and they suck. Excuse me. Uh, so I think a lot of it is education. It's learning. It's learning particular meditations. It's learning particular diets. It's learning particular yogas, if you were, that allow the interaction between our body and our energy. And once we can encapsulate and understand that we can oscillate our energy, we can oscillate our body with our minds, then there's a whole new avenue of things that open up. And that, goes back into the ancient texts when you're talking about the different forms of Krishna or the different forms of Buddha. Some of that is very heavily intoned with the idea of chi, ki, kai, your body's energy and its ability to harm or heal or change you in shape or weight, size, being. Those are all very common ancient stories, especially in regards to meditation and the practice of meditation, which is something that Jen did every day. And I actually practice several forms of meditation. A closed eye form where you sit quietly and let the world come to you. Brief meditation like my native grandmother, which is anytime you feel completely at peace. Doesn't matter if you turn around at your desk, doesn't matter if you're out walking your dog, a breeze blows and you're like, oh wow. Take at least 30 seconds. Soak that in. Recognize it. And the more you're able to do that, the more connected you become to nature and the more in tune you become with the reality of nature. Yes, world Bigfoot. Yeah, cynocephaly are definitely also from Syria and India. There are plenty of ancient accounts of that. And there are more than one type of dog person out there. This valley alone has 3 different types that I'm aware of. One in the grassland and 2 in the mountains, and I think one of them is cave dweller of some kind, and really, really large. Uh, Syria, all those areas have also had very ancient stories about dog people too. The ones in India, there's a flop-eared type of dog person. There's pointed-eared type of dog person. There are reports of them having dog legs, and there are reports of them having more primate-like legs or human-like legs. So there are also variations in body type, which also suggests variation of species of dog people. So there's also that potential that there are different races of them, and they're probably all over the world in different locations because they've lived around us and we've lived around them habitually forever anyway. Uh, Separate areas. Yeah, there have been some like that here, but not quite as large. Don't have separated rooms here. Up in the hills, not a lot, and they'll be pretty good size. They'll be waist height, and I have had some reports of the upside down height, and I have had some reports of the upside down basket structures like that being 10, 12 feet in height. Uh, so yeah, it's a common structure. Isolate. Let me see if there's another question here. Let me see if there's another question here. World Bigfoot. I found a giant track, 31 inches long, spring 2023 in Montana. I can believe that. Um, some of the higher up you get in elevation, it seems like the larger some of these cryptids become. And that can be species oriented, and it can also be the fact that some of them don't stop growing. Some cryptids, especially in the guanche line, have a tendency not to have a gene that tells their bodies to stop growing, like a ligrin. So they just keep growing and growing and growing. So as they grow too big to be in the lower lands, it'd be noticed too much. They go up into higher recessed areas that are not as accessible. And in the event that they grow over 15 feet in height, they typically head, either into the Rockies or they'll follow the Rockies up into the Okanagan. And if they don't have enough cover in the Okanagan, they go on up into Alaska. It's not unknown. It's actually a known process here in Oregon because Jen's father was 11 and a half feet tall, and her family was concerned that he he had that genetic issue and that he wouldn't stop growing, and they figured that once he hit 12 or 14 feet, he would not be able to hide, so he would have to move further north or away from his family in order to keep them safe so he wouldn't be the one that got noticed. So there's also that. Well, if I had a way of being able to write a book, I would. But right now, I've got too much on my plate, which is trying to live and do this work. And I do want to write some books. I really want to have the time to be able to write books. I've got so much I want to write about. But for now, I'm going to have to stick with this because I'm trying to get as much information, as much lore out as possible, as much as I can about the language that cryptids use. So in the event that I disappear or that something peculiar happens to me, there will be some sort of base of information out there that people can draw on later. Miss Magic. Oh, sister, you poor voice. Sounds like it's had enough for the evening. Yeah, I know. I'm getting there, aren't I? All scratchy. No worries, Judy. I'm glad to have you here. Uh, oh yeah, I normally don't. My work schedule is evenings anyway. I work 5:30 p.m. to 2 a.m. So this is in the middle of my afternoon. It's just that a flash of beauty came today, Bigfoot Project YouTube channel, and I spent a few hours film recording a documentary, excuse me, and then I decided to talk a little bit about, because they kind of gave me a good little boost, information-wise. So I figured I could start sharing more, uh, and in a more diligent manner. I've been trying to give not only tracking evidence, so that as you go out in the world, you can understand what's around you, along with the stories. But they really gave me a kind of a yay hey for you really need to tell more of your stories and do it now. So that's kind of why I've started doing that again, instead of just the tracking. But I've had so much going on in my life. I don't have enough hours in the day to or hours. Well, actually, Jared, when I was in Canada on Vancouver Island, there was reports of a local individual that everybody believed was a. I got to see him one night, and I think he might have been an actual vampire. He had some very unusual characteristics. One, he had clear skin. Uh, you could see the fine veins in the tone of his skin. He was also incredibly pale haired. He had very pale colored eyes. He had four joints for his fingers, not the three like us. He had an extra little bone. And that's a characteristic of vampires, actually, to have four jointed hands instead of three jointed hands. They still have five fingers, but they have four joints, instead of our three. And that's also part of the native stories about vampiric people is they have four jointed hands. So I believe that particular individual may have actually been a real vampire of some kind. There are also stories from Europe that describe similar, and he did have, longer canines. And that was another shocker because he actually came up close enough to me to speak to him face to face for a few minutes. We were in a public area and I was out with friends, thank God. And it was actually one of my friends who's like, I know where this person hangs out. I want you to see them. I want you to meet them. And he unnerved me at 4 foot away. I didn't, he was very polite, acted very human, but he was very unnerving to be around. My spidey senses were like, oh my God, this is not a pretend person. This is not, and then I saw the finger jointing and I remembered my grandmother's stories and I'm like, oh my God, that's really what a European vampire looks like. That's really what a Native American vampire looks. That's what that thing is. It's, oh my God, they do look human. But, just slight little variations, the extra jointed fingers, the slightly longer canines, the very clear skin, very, very pale overall. So some of the classical features are there. I don't know if they can turn into mist. I don't know. I don't know if they can shapeshift, but so many stories say that they can and that they do. It's possibly true. And, my grandmother put them into the red bone family groups. She considered anything that was dark, evil, or bad to be a red bone person. Might have been her own prejudice, but it might have also just been her teaching and her lore. How we classify them in our native minds. Hey Jody, I'm fascinated with Jen Jen's Buddhistic habits. How did that come to her? Her mother, her family? It was her family's way actually, and it's part of the Oma culture as far as I could tell from what she described. And it's always the female in the family that sets the tone of the religion and the way the family is going to be raised. As I said previously, females are considered the peace chiefs, so they dictate the home. They dictate what religion is practiced. And that was one of the conversations that happened between Guanch and Jen Jen when they were talking about marriage. He had to give up his dear society in order to become more Buddhistic. But he was willing to do that in order to save her and help her. So there's also the concept of conversion. And in her Buddhistic ways, she did not practice any form of cutting, piercing, uh, no scarification. You couldn't uh, take the hide off of an animal. You couldn't cause pain to any food animal That's why she always quickly broke its neck, so it would be completely unaware of what was happening to it. And she would always pray over it, to be born not as a food animal, but as a higher life form. So she also had the concept of reincarnation, and that, if you started out as a food item animal, you had the chance to become something more revered, something more human-like. And she also had the concept that those people that acted poorly or badly were actually, you know, taking the wrong reincarnation path. They were becoming red bone people in her mind. So there's also that potential. Maybe that's where a lot of our religions historically have the split concept, good and bad, dark and light. Uh, you know, those that do nasty things and those that act appropriately, you in harmony with the Creator, and those that are not in harmony with the creation. Uh, those myths all seem so similar when you really boil them down to their basic concepts. Yeah. You also may have to consider World Bigfoot, GMO Dogman. Uh, we have no idea what our governments or our tech industries or our medical industries are doing with any kind of cryptid they may have found, captured, killed, etc. And if we can crossbreed with them, I'm pretty sure they're probably messing with stuff genetically. Or they could be doing it like the old Europeans of the noble lands. World War One happened to eliminate a whole bunch of historic royalty all over Europe. Uh, you know, and that may have been because, there have been rumors within noble houses of keeping cryptids and mating with them and creating offspring. So the idea of the modern process just being accelerated or more so is simply just maybe what had been going on in the past anyway. Brotherhood of the Wolf movie actually kind of brings that whole concept to mind. It's based actually on kind of a true story in some ways, because there were natives taken to Europe, and some of them were medicine people, and some of them were taken there to describe, understand, or teach Europeans about cryptids over there that they didn't know what to do with or how to handle. But at the same time, there were also a lot of rumors that came back from any natives that actually survived going to Europe. And they would often say, they're marrying the bad ones. They're marrying and mating with the redbone people, these noblemen that we've been carted around the world by. And that was a pretty common thing that was told, you know, if they ever made it home. And there are some stories here in the Northwest, you know, hereditary stories about that sort of thing where natives have gone, due to colonists, and then come back with, stories about noblemen messing around with mating with cryptids that are not cool, like Gugway or vampires or, you know, cannibalistic ones. So, if those all people also become our world leaders, what the heck are they? Oh, and my back. So I'm going to answer the last few questions, see if I can get through all of them. Are vampires considered cryptids with full fangs? I use the term cryptid as simply an undiscovered or unknown or unidentified species. So technically, I guess a vampire has been a known identified species, though we don't have a living example of them. We don't have one in a cage. We don't have one in a mortuary. We don't have physical evidence of one, but we have got plenty of stories and potentially plenty of visual references especially with people who have four jointed fingers, because those people are probably crossbred with vampires, to be honest. Mermaid. They throw pebbles at me. This happens all the time on our land. I say hello and ask how they are. I tell them why I'm there, and I hear them following me. Just once I did feel absolute terror, and I laughed. Yeah, when they throw the little pebbles at you, it just means you're a little too close. And yes, do follow your inner instinct. If your spidey sense goes off, if you feel frightened, if you feel something's not right, it might be a predator species in the area, because up here there are plenty of skookum, and I always know when the bad dog man comes through, because they kind of dogpile his house and make sure it doesn't get here. But they also warn me about it, and I can sense that it's coming through because I get the glue. I feel my spidey sense go off. I don't feel safe. So always follow your instincts. If you are around a cryptid area, even if it's a friendly cryptid area, there is always the potential that there is a red bone person passing through. And if you haven't been warned of it, utilize your instincts. Yeah, no worries, uh, mermaid. I actually prefer that this knowledge is out. That was my grandmother's dying wish. If I didn't have a child to teach it to make sure that it was known publicly. Oh yeah, I had a great time today, Cosmic. Uh, Everybody from Flash Beauty are awesome people. They're uh, very bright, very intelligent, very earnest, very honest people. And I really appreciate their time and effort and diligence. And oh, please go visit their site. Please support them. Please, help fund them if they are requesting funding, because the only way we're going to be able to solve this is to support and help each other. There are no avenues to get resources to, you know, make documentaries or to, do any field research. We have to fund ourselves in some way. There are no grants for this. There are no public funds available, because we're dealing with mythic creatures that don't exist, that we all seem to know about. Funny how that is. Uh, World of Bigfoot. Look at my bio. Email me, please. You're gonna have to walk through how to link up on my phone, because I don't have a computer that has any kind of internet up here. And I would love to be able to do something like that. Just walk me through how to hook up with you guys. Maybe I can go live with you or something through my phone. Let me know, see what we can do. I'd be happy to help you out. I'd be grateful for an interview. And please question the heck out of me. I'll do what I can to answer them. Tony, do you like T-bone, doofus? Ask your own conversation. Uh, did the vampire, mermaid, did the vampire approach you because he felt your energy? Do you believe that thinking or speaking about cryptids draws them to us? I think that particular individual actually was drawn to me because I was wearing fake fangs that night. And what he literally said to me, he's walked over and he said, "Would you like me to make those real for you? Because I can." No, sir, I don't want you to. Because it was a Halloween party and he didn't look like he was wearing a costume. But, he definitely seemed to single me out because he thought I might be interested in turning to the dark side, as it were, which I am not. I prefer to keep away from them and or fight them, not join them. Okay, Jody, because Jen was adverse to harming any animal, even food. What did you think about folks in the mink breeding, farming trade? Well, she didn't like it. Neither did I, actually. But that was my father's industry. That was the way he made his living, and that was something he had done his entire life, and also something both of his parents had done all of their lives. It was a way they made their living. Um, but she didn't believe in it. She felt that it was wrong, and she didn't believe in removing the hide of an animal unless it was for a punishment, as in a legal recourse, um, a matter of judicial judgment was the only reason she would harm another thing in a bloodletting, cutting way. And that was done to the Gugway that had attacked her. They corporally punished him. And part of that punishment was to put his pelt on a pig pole and, twist his arm off that had repeatedly beaten her, that he had hit her with. From the elbow down, that hand was hung also on the pig pole, the big hash mark. That I covered in the concepts of, cryptid capital punishment. That was the only time she broke that rule, was for capital punishment purposes. And even then she prayed about it. Bad pup. New Orleans has vampires, and there are three types I know of. Just one being an energy vampire, but not bloodsucker. The other two are much worse. Yeah, I've heard a lot of stories about New Orleans, and some of them have been from people who have lived there, and some of those stories have been from people who've grown up there. And yeah, I believe there are quite a few unusual cryptids, including vampires around New Orleans, along with cat people and some other stuff, because I've been told about it by people I trust. So let me try to answer one. So let me try to answer one. I always thought the best of Godiva was a son of Sepley who was taking revenge over having a family member killed during the eradication of the wolves of France. Yeah, I would tend to potentially agree with that assessment. I think I'm going to have to kick off here though. I've been on for 2 hours and my phone is starting to die. And, feel free to email me, drop me a line in my post box if you want. Uh, Otherwise, I will keep making some more videos, and it looks like I have a chance to make longer videos now, and because the new uploads are changing a little dynamics at YouTube, and I think I've got enough hours now to start giving you more material. So I think I'll be able to do that here soon, which will allow me to add more, give more details. When I'm in the field, I can take a little more time instead of having to be, 1, 2, 3 minutes, because, my phone's got some upgrades and updates, and so does, YouTube. So hopefully I'll be able to add more detail and give you guys a little more information, more about what I'm seeing out there and what the tracking evidence is and how to identify it as a tracker. That way, you'll be able to build a consistent rapport of information. Thank you, everyone. I'm so glad you attended. I appreciate all of you who are subscribers, and I appreciate all of you who pop in. I love you all. You guys are great. Please hang tough and keep coming back. You have a great night, and I'll see you around the block. And you're welcome. I love you guys. You're awesome.